Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Finn the Wire. I'm an Irish historian and I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast. As usual, you'll find links to that beneath this video. I'm in the middle of making a series on the history of the Great Hunger here on YouTube, and today I have a great topic for you. It's about Queen Victoria, a woman dubbed by the Irish radical Maud Gonne as the Famine Queen. And in this video, I'm going to look at what Queen Victoria did and didn't do for Ireland during the Great Famine of the 1840s. I'm going to look at the rumours that she only gave a donation of £5. I'm also going to look at how she helped fundraise money in England during the famine, and then look at what I think is the most controversial thing she did in the entire history of the Great Hunger, and that's her visit to Ireland in 1849. It's an absolutely fascinating story, so I'm going to begin with just a brief overview of Queen Victoria and how she came to the throne, and then I'm going to look at what she did in the 1840s during the Great Hunger. So Queen Victoria is unquestionably the most famous British monarch, I think, in all of history. Maybe Queen Elizabeth II is as well known. But Victoria certainly left her imprint on history. She was born in the early 19th century. She ascended to the throne at the age of 18 in 1837 and then remained on the throne until 1901. An entire epoch of history, the Victorian age, is named after her. But now what we're going to do is hone in on the 1840s and look at what she did and, as I say, didn't do during the Great Famine. So when the Great Famine breaks out in 1845, it's worth stating that Queen Victoria isn't ruling the United Kingdom, which included Ireland at the time, with an iron fist or anything like that. She was a constitutional monarch and she had a very limited formal role in the day-to-day running of the United Kingdom. That said, she did exert a lot of influence over life. We'll look at that in a minute. And her role wasn't purely symbolic. Certainly Victoria herself believed that she should have a greater role in day-to-day life. And she did have a big impact, as we're about to see. So probably the biggest impact she had is in terms of fundraising and personal donations to Ireland during the famine. So I want to look at that now because this is probably the thing that's surrounded by the most myth and conspiracy. So in late 1846 to early 1847, the British government of Lord John Russell actually started to pressurise Queen Victoria to do more in relation to Ireland. They felt that she wasn't making a big enough, I suppose, stand or statement about the Great Famine, which at this point, as I've recounted in previous videos, was reaching a terrible point by late 1846 into early 1847. And Queen Victoria does act on this, and in January 1847, she makes an appeal to the public in Britain to donate money to Ireland. And this is kind of combined with a special day in March 1847, where people were going to go to Mass and pray for Ireland, but also donate money. And Victoria herself does spearhead this. She actually writes a public letter that's published in British newspapers, urging people to support the starving Irish at this point. And this actually raises a huge amount of money. £172,000 is raised through these efforts, which is a pretty considerable amount of money at the time. So that is a significant event. Now, she does try to do the same thing again in October 1847, but that kind of falls flat on its face. Basically, by that point, the British public are growing increasingly weary of donating money to Ireland. I know that sounds strange, but basically they had something that's often called famine fatigue, where they read countless stories of starving people in Ireland, and they're growing increasingly immune to these stories, so they don't donate as much. That only raises £30,000. But I guess we can't really blame Victoria for that. So next I want to look at what she personally gave, because this is the source of some of the greatest controversy. So during the famine, Queen Victoria made a substantial donation to something called the British Relief Association, and that donation actually was £2,000. But there's huge problems with that donation. When you hear she only gave a fiver, that's not true. She did actually donate £2,000, but that is not as generous as it seems, and there's quite a few problems with that donation as well. So first of all, Victoria herself wanted to only give £1,000, but actually a leading Irish politician at the time kind of privately pointed out that that was just not enough and she would have to give more. So they upped the donation to £2,000. Now, that might seem generous, but there is actually a big problem. First of all, Victoria could have afforded more. But secondly, because she was the monarch at the time and she gave £2,000, that basically meant that no one else could give any more than that, because it would be seen as the incorrect thing to do. So by giving £2,000, she's essentially setting the limit at what any other individual is going to give. Now, we do know others were planning to give more. For example, we know the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at the time had planned to give £10,000, but he couldn't, when it was pointed out to him that Victoria had only given £2,000, he couldn't give that £10,000. Now, before we heap praise on the Sultan, we should also bear in mind he was also a monarch. He was trying to play for public opinion. He had been receiving all sorts of bad press at the time, and his donation of £10,000 is designed to make him seem pretty benign. So personally, I'm not into monarchs of any kind, and before we laud all the praise on the Sultan, we should bear in mind he had his own agenda too. But Victoria, in this donation of just £2,000, sets the bar, as I say, and it limits future donations. Now, what I want to turn to, though, is what actually happened in 1849, because I personally think this is probably the most problematic thing that Victoria did during the Great Famine. So after Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, she didn't come to Ireland, and this was certainly seen or noted at the time as controversial that this new monarch hadn't come to Ireland. Now, she did plan to come in 1846, but that visit had to be cancelled because the Great Famine was getting worse and worse and worse. And basically, they didn't want Victoria arriving into Ireland and being faced with crowds of starving people. However, in 1849, they decide that Victoria is going to come to Ireland, and this is done for political reasons. So firstly, there had been a small uprising in Ireland in 1848. It hadn't gone very far, but the British government wanted to demonstrate that they were totally in control of Ireland at the time, and a royal visit would demonstrate this. But secondly, and I think most problematically, Victoria's visit to Ireland in 1849 was designed to show the world the famine was over. And I think this is really problematic. So I'm going to look at Victoria's visit and some of the fallout from that. So Victoria arrived in Ireland in early August 1849. She first travelled to Cork. She landed in the port of Cove, then went up to Cork City. She then travelled by private yacht. I'm going to come back to that. That's really important. But she travelled by private yacht, stopping at Waterford, then travelled on to Dublin, then travelled to Belfast, and from there she went on back to Britain. She landed at Scotland after that. But this visit had been really carefully planned and managed by British officials in Ireland to basically present the Queen in the best possible light, but make sure also that she did not encounter anyone who was starving. So, for example, I've already mentioned she travelled by yacht when she was here. That was done so she would not pass through the Irish countryside and see starving people firsthand. She also visited mainly urban areas. So I've mentioned Cork, she visited Waterford, she visited Dublin, and she visited Belfast. While she was in Dublin, she did travel to County Kildare, where she went to Carton House, a residence of the Duke of Leinster. But in all these visits, she's going to urban areas, and then any rural areas she visits are in the east of the country. And this is done because these are the areas that are starting to recover from the famine in 1849. But a lot of the island isn't recovering. For example, had she travelled into the west, she would have seen horrific destitution, continued starvation. But the British government and British officials in Ireland designed this visit to avoid that. And in many ways, the visit was designed to actually hide that, because by Victoria coming to Ireland and going to areas where the famine was starting to ease, this created the illusion all around the world that the famine was definitely a thing of the past and people didn't need to think about it anymore. Now, it should be said, when she visited Ireland and she landed in Cork and in Dublin, she received widespread acclaim. Like, there was large crowds turned out to welcome the Queen. But again, this is all very carefully staged, managed and choreographed. Had she gone to other parts of Ireland, the situation would have been very different. And this visit, as I say, was designed to very much benefit the British government politically. And I actually think that's probably the most problematic thing that Queen Victoria does, because the famine didn't end in 1849. In parts of the West, into the early and even mid-1850s, horrific destitution remains part and parcel of daily life. If you look at workhouses are full to the brim right through the 1850s of people who are completely destitute. Also, had she travelled to the west of Ireland in the late 1840s, she would have encountered the devastation of evictions, which I covered in the last video, but she would have seen the impact they were having on rural areas. She would have seen the destroyed houses, the huge numbers of people that had been made homeless by those evictions. And as I say, her visit to Ireland is designed not only to avoid that, but also in many ways mask that, because the arrival of the British monarch to Ireland kind of signals to the world that everything is fine in Ireland. And that, for me, is probably the most problematic part of Victoria's involvement in Ireland. It's a political one. But also, look, we saw that she donated £2,000, and there was a big problem by doing that, because by donating £2,000, she capped what everyone else would give. Now, let me know what you think about this. Do drop a comment. If you've also got any questions you'd like me to answer, let me know. This video is based off questions I've received under previous videos. A lot of people were asking me about Queen Victoria's role, so I hope this kind of sheds light on it. And finally, I'll just say thanks for your time. I really appreciate you tuning in.